The sad thing about the Israel and Palestine conflict is that it has outlived many people, and it might outlive you and I as well. And every time we witness something we are witnessing at the moment, we show our sympathy, we raise our voice for peace, and we come back to the same question over and over again, that why does this conflict exist in the first place, and how or when will it end? And of course, there are no easy answers, because if there were, we wouldn't be seeing what we are seeing at the moment. So, coming back to the question about the conflict and our understanding of it, I think we need to read the history. Because if we don't do that, if we don't read books on that, we miss the nuances. We simply go by the simple narratives that there is one bad guy, there is one good guy, and the bad guy is probably killing the good guys. And depending on our political affiliation, we decide who is the bad guy, who is the good guy. But of course, there are so many nuances in that. And that is something we explore as we read these books. So there are some books I'm going to recommend to you today. And there are, of course, vast number of books available. But I'm going to recommend only those books where you find sort of two narratives presented, both the Israeli side and the Palestinian side. And my intention here is not to just present a neutral view or discourage you from taking any side, but to sharpen your arguments, and whatever side you have or whichever way you want to frame your arguments, I want you to go through all the different kind of caveats and challenges. So the first book is O Jerusalem, which is really well-researched book, and it really gives you the idea of how Israel was created. And at the same time, it's really an interesting read. So that's one. Another one is called The Israel-Palestine Conflict, Contested Histories. And the third one is called Israel and Palestine, A Common Historical Narrative. So in these books, you'll find both sides of the story, what they are going through, what their narratives are, and how they are seeing the same events from different lenses. And in today's podcast, I'm going to briefly discuss this history of the whole conflict and the creation of Israel. And I hope you would make sense out of it. But of course, I would still encourage you to go through these books and even beyond them, and do a lot of reading on the subject before you decide what your opinions are on the subject. So let's start. Where does it begin? From Israelis or Jews' point of view, it begins almost 4,000 years ago, when the Almighty God Himself promises the land of Canaan to Jews. And of course, in today's world, we can't take it seriously. So we'll have to come back to the more recent times and see what was going on around 100 years ago, at the beginning of the 20th century. And don't worry, I'll go back to the history as well, but let's just start from here. What's going on? So in this holy land, which we now know as Israel and Palestine, there were Muslims, and they were the majority there. And there was a large minority of Christians and a smaller minority of Jews. So, as I said, Jews, they considered that this land was theirs according to the Bible. because God promised them. And on the other hand, Palestinians, I mean mostly the Arabs and Muslims, they considered themselves the sons of the soil. So they assumed it was their country. But of course, it didn't belong to either. It was under the rule of Ottoman Empire. So what about the Jews? Were all the Jews of the world living there? No, not at all. Until the 19th century, the majority of the Jews of the world, they lived in the diaspora. In fact, only around 25,000 Jews lived in this Holy Land, and millions of others, around 8 million Jews, they lived in Europe. But there has been a challenge for Jews. Throughout the history, they have faced inequality, discrimination, and at times persecutions and pogroms. And perhaps the worst example of that was 20th century Holocaust. So two things were happening towards the end of the 19th century. All these conditions for Jews, they were getting worse wherever they were living. And at the same time, the idea of a nation state, that was taking hold in different parts of the world. So these Jews who were living in Europe and were facing a lot of discrimination at that point, they came up with this movement called Zionist movement. And they considered, given what they were facing in other countries, they considered the idea of creating a new nation for Jews. And they considered some options, like they considered some parts of Argentina. They, of course, considered the Holy Land of Palestine. And since the idea of the Holy Land was more romantic in a sense, because it was rallying around the idea of religion, they went ahead with that. And slowly, they started moving into this Holy Land. And how did they do that? They started purchasing their property, and for that they raised funds all over the world, and individually they started purchasing properties in what we know as the Palestine, or what then was the Ottoman Empire. So that was happening around the end of the 19th century. So that was what we now know as the first phase of Jewish immigration. And then there is the second phase of Jewish immigration, which starts around the early 20th century, around the year of 1903, and goes on to the point of before the start of the First World War, 1914. And then they had started working on this idea that they wanted to create a national economy and autonomy within the Ottoman Empire. And as you know, Ottoman Empire was losing, and it did lose against the British in the First World War. So you could see that there was going to be a power vacuum once the British left the country, because it was going to happen sooner or later. So while on one side you had this Jewish nationalism, at the same time this Arab nationalism, this idea was also beginning to emerge. And right after this First World War, the Jewish immigration really accelerated between the British Empire and this Holy Land. In fact, people from most of the Europe, they started moving towards their Holy Land. So as I said before, they were purchasing property mostly on the individual level, but they were purchasing from big landowners. And in fact, by 1948, which is when Israel really came into existence, 7% of the land of Palestine had been purchased by these Jewish Zionist organizations. But that was it. They were buying properties and living there. But of course, they had this idea they were going to create a nation out of it. And it was becoming a headache for the British Empire as well, because they were going to leave at some point. And then who was going to rule after them? And it was particularly becoming problematic around the time of 1930 to 1945, because these large chunks of immigrants, the Jews that were coming in, and they were having conflicts with the indigenous population. And one might even think about the idea that they could have lived together, the two groups, and probably formed one nation. But that was really, really difficult to have, because neither of them considered the other a part of their own. They had two different cultures, two different religions, two worldviews. In fact, languages were different. So this was clearly a headache for the empire. And what they usually do, in fact, something they also did in the case of India-Pakistan partition, is that very carelessly they made contradictory claims. On one side, they promised the Jews that they are going to have their separate nation, and on the other, they made a promise to the Palestinians that they are going to get their country. Now, how was that going to happen? Nobody knew. But as I said, those conflicts had started, and earlier in the early 1920s, there were some early skirmishes. On 1929 onwards, there were riots between these two communities. So by 1930s, the Arabs, the Muslims of Palestine, they had got so frustrated of this British policy, they decided to revolt against the British and went on a general strike. And these people demanded that all the immigration that was taking place, that was supposed to be checked. And they expressed their fears regarding the Jewish nation and how it could be a threat to the Muslims, to the Arabs. And then the Second World War happened. And in that, what happened, and particularly what happened in Germany, Nazi Germany, we all know that. The Holocaust, and millions of Jews, they died. So at this point, the Jewish immigration, which Palestinians thought would slow down, it in fact accelerated to a great extent. And the world had now seen the horrors of the Holocaust. And the British had seen them too. United Nations, which was formed, they had seen it too. So there was this global effort, and which was of course facilitated by the Zionists, that these Jewish Holocaust survivors and other Jews of the Europe, they should be sent to a safe place and probably to this new country. It also must be mentioned that it was not just in Germany these Jews were facing pogroms and executions. So, as one example, the 1 million Jews who survived the war in Poland, they experienced a pogrom in 1946, which was 1 year after the war. So the Jews, on one hand, they really didn't have a choice. They had to go somewhere. And on the other hand, Palestinians, for them, the news of this Holocaust wasn't really widely known. Most of them, they didn't believe the exact figures. And there were some who believed and said that Jews were probably using these figures to justify their own displacement and create a new nation. In fact, in many cases, there was also this idea of Holocaust denial. Now, which one of the two sides was right? We don't know that. But these are the two versions that you get from two sides. So eventually, when in 1947, UN had to decide the fate and made recommendations, they came up with two plans. There was a majority plan in which around 56% of the land would go to the Jewish community, and then there was a minority plan which was in the form of a federation of separate Jewish and Arab states. The Jews, they accepted the majority plan, while the Palestinians, they rejected both plans, insisting that Palestine was part of the Arab world and that will always be the case. So much like the partition of India and Pakistan in 1947, the same thing happened with Israel and Palestine. The United Nations endorsed this partition, and then, as you would expect, just like in the case of India and Pakistan, a civil war broke out in Palestine. And both sides have already created their own armies. Jews, for one reason, because they knew they were going to tackle the enemy. There were going to be many oppositions. And Arabs from surrounding countries, they, alongside Palestinians, they formed Arab Liberation Army. Because Palestinians, they felt that a great injustice had been done to them, and they couldn't understand this logic that 55% of the land, 56% of the land was given to the Jews when they were minority in population and owned only 7% of the land. But if you see it from the Israeli perspective, the reason was that more and more refugees, immigrants were going to come in from Europe, and they also made the case that the land that Palestinians owned, it was their private land, just like the Jews owned their private land. When it came to the state, creation of the state, it had to be decided on different parameters, and even the borders and the different territories of Palestine. For example, there was Gaza, there was Jerusalem, there was West Bank. All three of them were supposed to go to Palestine, and in the middle there was Israel. On both sides there was Palestine, this which is again very similar to the partition of India, where East and West Pakistan was there. The Eastern Pakistan, which is now Bangladesh, and in the middle there was another country. So this is when we get to the first war between the Arabs and Israelis, and it took place in 1948. Israelis also call this as the Israeli War of Independence. And what happened in this war was something that was going to become theme for the next many decades, that there was attack from the Arab side. Then Israelis, they retaliated with force, and they retaliated in such a way to instill fear among Palestinians so that they were forced to leave their country. And in the meantime, the Israelis, they could expand their territory. So that started in 1948. What they got before the war, they had expanded that right after the war. And many Palestinian refugees, they had to leave their country, and then they moved to different Arab countries. And on the Israeli side, they started accepting a lot more Jewish immigrants. Now there were talks going on between Palestine and Israel that Israel need to allow these refugees to return to Palestine. And Israel wouldn't allow that because it feared that these many people, if they came back and who were really their enemies, they were going to go after them again and probably try to end the Jewish state again. So they tried to limit that number. They insisted on very small fraction of those refugees, and to which the Arab countries did not agree. Nor did the Arab countries agree to the fact that they would absorb all these refugees, because they felt that if they did that, then the Palestinian cause, that'll end right there. So still some kind of battles were going on during 1950s. So there were these Fida'in, the suicide attackers from mostly from Egypt and Jordan. They were attacking Israel. And this went on until 1967. This is called the 1967 War, also known as the 6-Day War, which, as you would know, lasted for 6 days. So in this war, once again, Israel fought its enemies, which were the Arabs. Once again, it expanded its territory, and once again, more Palestinian refugees were left homeless. So now Israel had got the West Bank and Gaza. And then there was another war in 1973, and it had the same theme: Arabs attacking Israel from different sides, Israelis fighting back, and then expanding their territory. And since then, there hasn't been any major war between the Arab states and Israel. It's only been between the Israel and the Palestine then onwards. Of course, they keep fighting indirectly in different ways. Even Iran does that. They fund and help different militant organizations, but there hasn't been a direct war between these countries ever since. So that point onwards, Israelis started working on this settlement project, where what was supposed to be earlier the Palestinian territory, they would build their settlements, their houses, buildings, and take control of that area. So if you see the map, the Palestinians are now getting more and more confined to smaller territories. So what happened was, now the situation had reversed, because earlier there was a solution on the table. The Palestinians didn't agree, and when they demanded the earlier situation on the map, and Israel said, no, we can't do that. And in fact, they keep going further and further into Palestine's territory. And Israel's reason is that because the Palestinians, and particularly their militant organization Hamas, they want to destroy the Jews. They can't risk it. So they are taking the war away from the mainland of Israel to deeper into the Palestinian territories, and they are saying that in order to maintain that security, they need to keep a check on the Palestinians. So now we are witnessing this situation, and we have been witnessing it for decades now, that there are attacks from both sides, and each side claims that the other started it, the other provoked it, and then they only retaliated. And even now there is confusion that who does the land belong to, because there was no country until these two new states emerged after the UN resolution, and now both claim that it belongs to them. So what could be the solution in that case? Of course, it has to be the two-state solution which everyone has been advocating for the last 1 century. And there has to be political consensus between these two parties about the two-state solution, which we don't find. Because neither side wants to give up or wants to lose. So on one side, the Israelis, they keep expanding their land, their territories, and on the other, Palestinians led by the Hamas, they keep using their militants to attack the Israelis. And they often do that from, they launch their rockets, for example, from residential areas. And so that what happens is when Israel has to strike back, it bombs the civilian population of Palestine, and then conflicts goes up again. But then again, it depends on which narrative you're listening to. One side says they fired first, and the other says the other party did that. Just like the last night, the Israel said that Hamas fired over 100 rockets into Israeli cities, and Hamas said that they fired it after Israel bombed their residential areas. And Israel said, we bombed those residential areas because that is where these militants were firing their rockets from. So both sides have their own truths. But of course, we can see that the two sides want different things. On one side, now Israel is in a position of power, and it is looking for its complete dominance in that region. And on the other hand, there is Palestine, which is kind of battling for its survival and therefore employing all kinds of these militant means to fight its enemy. So that's why it's a really, really complex and fascinating problem. And if you see it from the lens of history, in fact, you can see it from the lens of religion as well. Many people deny that there is no element of religion. And that may not be the case when two governments deal with each other. But when you see the local level protests, riots, and even Hamas charter against the Jews, they do use their scriptures, they do use their theological teachings. So that's why at different levels, it's a really, really complicated problem. And once again, I would encourage you to read on this subject and then see how much there is in it. And in this podcast, I haven't even touched the surface. It was just a very brief outline of what happened in that period. Of course, there were many, many more events, but I just tried to give you some basic idea of what happened back then and what is happening right now. So I hope you would read these books, and you would read many more, way more than I have.